Committee of the Whole is back in order. I want to thank everybody for their patience this morning. I want to thank Senator Nicholas for his efforts this morning with the OFB staff to revise the amendments that are going to be presented. And so, Senator Nicholas, you're recognized.
Buenos dias, Mr. Chairman, and thank you also to the Office of Finance and Budget. This is a very complicated process. We're trying to ensure that everything is reconciling and balancing properly. And we've gone in several directions over the course of the last week. And I appreciate the patience of the body as well as the recess that we had to allow us to be able to reconcile all the figures throughout the budget with respect to the amendments that are being proffered. Again, we are continuing with the initial intent of realizing collections within 2019 as a funding source for the agencies primarily responsible for those collections, with the rollback of the hotel occupancy tax and the reaffirmation of the property tax for properties over $1 million. We've had to back out certain figures and also scrap certain amendments that were part of a sequence that was initially planned for a different chain of events. Today, Mr. Chairman, we have circulated fresh amendments, freshly reconciled with OFB, the Office of Finance and Budget, that also correlate directly with all of the other figures throughout the budget. With the retention of the property tax for properties over $1 million, we've had to add back those figures into the Territorial Educational Facilities Fund, which in turn adjusted the figures for the Guam Department of Education, which was previously going to have a larger general fund subsidy with the anticipation of a lower Territorial Educational Facilities Fund figure. Now that we've reconciled that and we've reconciled it to all of the other entities affected by these supplemental appropriations revenues, we're ready to move forward with the amendments fully balanced with the overall budgetary figures to date. And so, Mr. Chairman, the first amendment is again to the Supplemental Appropriations Revenue Fund figure, which reconciles to $18,180,075. This is our first amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Does everybody understand what is being done at this point? Senator Nicholas is amending his initial amendment and just changing the figure to $18,180,075. Senator, wish to be heard?
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you. If you could just explain, we left off with a figure of $18,750,067.
Yes, and he would like to amend it down.
We don't have any amended DOE figures in here from the adjusted TEF or anything. So what changed from the calculation from $18,750 to this one?
I'll have him explain himself.
We actually do have the amended TEF figures here. If we reference 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth page in, you will see the changed TEF figures for the Department of Education. So it is a subsequent amendment as part of the rebalancing of the figures.
I believe the Senator has a whole series, and this is just the first one, is to first amend the number. Is there anyone who wishes to be heard on this initial amendment? Any senator? Senator Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I understand this is the first of many series to come, but I'm also aware that eventually this SAR fund, if it's adopted, will continuously have to come back to make the necessary adjustment to the number should these following amendments pass. Is that what, maybe the author can answer that, is that what we are preparing to do here? So you know, we may adopt a number, but this number we're going to keep coming back to and introducing a new amendment, or as we go, this number just automatically adjusts itself.
Do you wish to yield?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's really a chicken or the egg question. Are we going to go in and amend the sources of funds to the agencies first, or are we going to establish that master figure and then go in and amend the agency figures? That's why we've taken the time to put everything into writing and to pass them out as a packet, so we can all see transparently how much we're talking about and where it's all going. The reason why we've had this number moving over the past few days was because these supplemental appropriations revenues are going to make up whatever difference we have in revenue generation from any tax increases. We initially were working with a figure that was going to not increase any taxes. Then we worked with a figure that was not going to increase the real property taxes. And now we're working with a figure that instead is not going to increase the hotel occupancy taxes. And so the only reason why this supplemental appropriations fund number is moving is because we're changing where we're generating the revenue from. And so unless we're going to be reconsidering any of the recent revenue generation motions over the past week, I don't think this figure will move, because in the subsequent amendments, we're not changing any of the appropriations to any of the agencies. We're just changing where they're getting their money from. And so their bottom line figures are all going to remain the same. And I don't think, unless somebody has a different rational basis, I don't think we're going to be seeing a change in those bottom line figures at all. And so if we don't see a change in the bottom line figures, then this master figure of $18,180,000 should not change. Mr. Chairman.
Is that satisfactory, Senator?
I appreciate the response, Mr. Chair. I was just thinking the other option would be to just establish the fund at zero, and, you know, should these amendments pass, we'll know the actual bottom line, instead to keep coming back at it. Because, again, we're making the assumption that all these amendments are going to pass. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't mean to delay this, but I'm trying to follow with using the packet that we had last week and this week, and they're different because this is the first time the DOE is in here, and that's what I had asked last week about. But GPD is also not in here this time. Am I seeing this correctly? And so I was wondering.
Okay, I've just been advised by legal that I have to go back because we shouldn't be discussing this yet. We had an amendment on the floor that has to be withdrawn and then move forward. And I think if everybody just ignores what you had last week and just takes this new one, don't confuse yourself with last week's numbers. All right, we'll have to start anew. All right, so Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a
To
point of
comply
order.
with,
I'd like to first
rule of
withdraw
order.
my amendment that we left off with last week.
The amendment that we had on the floor last week relates to the office of the governor, and so it's withdrawn. Anybody have any objection to withdrawing that? Hearing none, it's withdrawn. And so before that was the SAR, and now he's amending what that was. So we'll have to amend what was amended first and then go through. And everybody if we just stick to this and stop looking at the ones from last week, you're going to confuse yourselves. All right, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So just the same amendment of amending the amended supplemental appropriations revenue fund number.
Anybody else on the
18
amended supplemental appropriation number that being proffered? Yes. Today's number. Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much for the mover of the amendment. Mr. Speaker, just so that there's a general understanding in regards to where the supplemental and appropriations revenue may originate from, we are looking at part of the previous conversation, and I know we're repeating some of the statements that have been made last week, but we need to ensure that our people have a general understanding as to the legitimacy of incorporating this number into the budget. We're looking at the supplemental appropriation revenue figure to be modified from what was adopted last week to $18 million. When the Director of Revenue Tax was here sharing information, he had identified that approximately $73 million remain outstanding tax receivables that fall into a collectible category. And of the $73 million, now based on the recalculated figure of $18.1 million that is being proffered, that's approximately 24.9%. The only question I have, I certainly support this, Mr. Speaker, because it encourages the executive branch to be much more aggressive and assertive in pursuing outstanding tax receivables, especially those that have fallen into the category of collectible and are not the current tax receivables, which traditionally people would remit their real estate taxes in the proper month, whether it's February, also remit their appropriate tax due, whether it's when they file on April 15th. So, Mr. Speaker, just looking at this amount is 24.9% of the identified $73 million that are collectible. My question in this case is, we are sending a message to the executive branch, be aggressive, go out there and collect these tax receivables. We've already provided in this year's budget some people resources so that they can be that much more aggressive in terms of implementing the collections and pursuing some of the outstanding amounts. One of the questions that was posed when the director was here is automation. Whether in fact there's need for additional resources so that they can automate and ensure that they're able to collect in a more timely manner and also pursue some of these outstanding tax receivables. Another question that was posed is looking at hiring a tax attorney, which is incidentally in the code today. It is an allowance that is provided to the Director of the Department of Revenue and Taxation to be able to go out there and aggressively collect, whether it's through the legal means, through eventual prosecution, or whatever the approach will be. But this would be another resource available to the Director of Revenue Tax to be able to go out there and collect any amount of the $73 million that is outstanding, or at a very minimum, based on the amount that is being proffered, the $18.1 million. So, Mr. Speaker, the one question I have is to the mover of the amendment. We're looking at not only modifying the supplemental appropriation revenue amount, but based on the anticipated allocation of these resources, are we looking at providing any additional funds above and beyond what was originally targeted in bill number, or provided in bill number 323, so that it would provide the Director of Revenue Tax, which is the collection arm of this government, to be able to either enhance their technology, their use of technology and automation, or hire the appropriate tax attorney, or utilize those resources to enhance their collection process. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is this budget proposal based on the 18.1, would that provide additional resources to Revenue Tax, whether it's an additional $1 million or an additional $2 million, so that in fact they can actually be reinforced with procuring or acquiring additional tools and resources to go on and actually collect? Mr. Speaker, if I can ask the sponsor of the amendment to you.
Do you yield?
The amounts that we have here are tagged directly to the amendments that that follow. If we're going to be funding anything in addition to what follows this figure, it would need to be added to this figure.
then maybe we should take Senator Morrison's admonition and put this at the end and go through it. And since we're dealing with SAR money, if people want to make the amendments to provide the cash for the appropriation for the attorney and for everything else, and the $6 million computer system, add it on and make them collect it.
Just to, on the, and referencing the inquiry, Mr. Chairman, and the reason why what you'll find in the subsequent amendments is that as we add, as we increase our reliance on the Supplemental Appropriations Revenue Fund, the source of the funds for whatever it is that we're paying for becomes further strained. There's a reason why we're keeping it at 18 million, and we ranged it all the way up to 26 million last week, is because with the overall figure of 73 million by rev and tax, the closer we push to the 73 million, the more we're requiring a higher percentage collections rate from the administration, and we can push the envelope, Mr. Chairman, but the more we contain the figure, the more attainable it is. And the reality is, we want this figure to be attainable so that we don't have a deficit at the end of the fiscal year. 18 million out of 73 million is attainable. If we do want to go through an exercise of just adding on however we want, that's the will of the body. But I would caution discipline in so doing, because the more we push this figure, the greater we exacerbate the risks, Mr. Chairman.
I guess if I may just close, Mr. Speaker, in this particular case, we are looking at amending a $26 million figure that was, isn't that the amendment?
That was what was adopted last week, yes.
Yes. So we're looking at amending a figure of $26 million that was adopted last week by this body downward to $18 million to reflect the more balanced number as it applies to some of the additional actions taken by this body. So that's why, I mean, I'm not looking at trying to perhaps extend the discussion other than making sure that if we're going to require above and beyond what Rev and Tax is presently doing and all of their personnel to be able to go out there and aggressively collect the additional $18.1 million, I only feel that it's proper to provide them with enhanced tools, unless there are provisions in this budget that would provide the chief executive with flexibility to be able to move resources around so that this can be attained. So that was the only reason why, Mr. Speaker, I was asking, because I would hate to see Reverend Tax say we're collecting at the levels that we collected in the prior year, fiscal year, but not above and beyond, and that may be a questionable figure in terms of the ability to be able to collect the 18.1, rather than providing them with additional resources, which is a critical service to this government, additional resources so that they can go out there and realistically collect 18.1 or 26 or whatever the figure they are able to pursue. So I just wanted to bring that up as a concern. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Anybody else on this amended figure? Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to confirm, so does this amount not include the amendment that was passed last week regarding the Attorney General's ability to collect with, I think it was 300,000?
This is not my amendment. It's, you can, Senator Nicholas, do you wish to address this? This is not my amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, this does not include that figure. We can include that. Again, we're just tagging it strictly to the budgetary figures provided by the Office of Finance and Budget. But there was no objection to that amendment last week. If the Speaker would like to make that amendment, I believe it may be entertained on the floor.
Yes, I guess I would have to renew the motion then, Mr. Speaker. I would renew that motion.
Which motion?
The motion to add $300,000 to the SAR fund and to, with the understanding that that will be appropriated to the Attorney General's office for their part in the collection of these taxes.
Oh,
That was what passed last week.
all right, so this number should go to 18,480
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
on the amended number of 18,480. Anybody else wish to be heard?
Mr. Speaker, what was the amendment for 300,000 to the AGs for what? What are they going to do?
When the Department of Revenue and Taxation was here, the director said that a lot of their collections at this point are at the Attorney General's office. And so I believe that this 300,000 will allow the Attorney General to hopefully hire an additional attorney and to be able to aggressively pursue collection of those taxes.
That amendment was passed last week and was not added into this, and so this would have to be amended up 300 to take that into account, okay? So on the number 18,480,075, anybody else?
Mr. Speaker, just a quick question to the mover of the amendment. So that additional $300,000 is obviously targeted towards what was also mentioned a little earlier about possibly acquiring a tax attorney. So rather than going with an independent hiring, which the law already provides for Revenue Tax to procure a tax attorney, it would now be, those $300,000 would now be redirected to the Office of the Attorney General to provide an attorney. On a full-time basis, is that what we're looking at?
Well, we had written language last week, I'm trying to find it, that would make it general enough, because the problem was that, Revenue Tax could not hire a tax attorney despite their efforts, and I think the same thing happened at the Attorney General's office. But they do have attorneys, and they could hire attorneys that could do the tax work, even though they're not specifically tax attorneys. So that was my goal, was to make it broad enough that somebody dedicated to do this in whatever way they found possible at the time. And of course, the goal is to get a tax attorney, but because they were not able to do so, it would give them flexibility to do it in any way possible.
And I just want to close with this. I think that the responses that were received, although it was mentioned that they had tried, I just don't think the effort was aggressive enough to be able to procure an attorney or a firm to be able to support Revenue Tax on a full-time basis. And my final statement is, the key word that this mover of the amendment mentioned is dedicated towards tax collection for Revenue Tax. So I certainly hope that that $300,000 will be specifically targeted towards providing the necessary support for Revenue Tax. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
All right. There was an amendment passed last week, I've been assured for that purpose of, so that's going to have to be included in this calculation. So it's 18,480. Anybody else? Any objection to this new number? Thank you, Senator Nicholas. On your next amendment.
Thank you. Just before I proceed to my next amendment, just a point of information for the previous speaker. We will need an amendment drafted now to specifically earmark that $300,000 for that purpose intended. So it's not included in the amendments that we're going to be proffering at this time. So if the mover of the retiring speaker could just make sure that we include that as we proceed. Mr. Chairman, my next amendment.
Mr. Speaker, point of order, aren't we now going to adopt his amended amendment?
There was nobody else. There was no objection.
No, I understand. Based on...
It's amended to 480.
So that
1840.
entire figure was,
Yes.
rather than adopting that amendment and then moving to the amended amendment?
No,
Okay.
that,
Thank you,
that
Mr. Speaker.
amendment was adopted last week, so it's already in there. So we're going to have to take it into account. We just didn't take, it wasn't taken into account in this set. So
Okay.
what he's saying is, you prepare an amendment to the rev and tax if you want it specific, or you prepare an amendment for 300 to the AG's office to make it specific. One of you is responsible for that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So just on that point of order, Mr. Chairman, we've gavelled the 18,480. If we can just, we've gavelled the change to 18,480. If we can just gavel the final number at 18,480. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next amendment is the amendment to the Office of the Governor. We amend down their general fund number from 6 million down to 1.5 million. And we make up the difference with a supplemental appropriations revenue fund appropriation of 4.5 million, Mr. Chairman.
On this amendment, anyone wish to speak? Senator Nelson?
Just a question, Mr. Chair. Is this to include the 23% that, are we supplementing the 23% that we voted on earlier last week?
This is the
So are we
number that was...
restoring them back?
No,
Okay.
this was the final number.
All right, thank you, Mr.
Any senator wish to be heard on this amendment? Any senator wish to be heard on this amendment?
Mr. Chair, if I just,
Okay. Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to ask if you've received any input from Department of Revenue and Taxation since our discussions last week on these amendments, whether they have any input or comment on it.
No, I have not.
And does the Office of Finance and Budget support this? This is feasible? Do we know the collection rate right now? I calculated this to be a 25% collection rate if it's enforced.
I don't think that the Office of Finance and Budget is in the position to make a statement in that way, nor is the Committee on Appropriations. We issued jointly a bill that we thought would take care of this.
Do
This
we know the
is-
current, like the collection rate for FY17, for example, that we could compare what we're asking them to do here?
But this is not the same as the collection rate for any year. These were uncollected amounts, and it becomes harder. You know that when any bill is paid and you have people just pay as they should, that's an easy collection. But trying to collect on delinquent ones is a completely different formula and a different percentage. I'm not going to speak further.
Well, that's all I'm asking, Mr. Speaker, is if we know what they've been able to do in the past with these types of delinquent accounts. Now, he said the words, these are collectible, when he said they did their, their review of all of these, that 73 million was collectible. He didn't say how hard it was going to be, but that's why I'm wondering if in the past we have any collection rates to compare it to. Just wanted to make sure about that, Mr. Speaker. You're saying there's none?
Unless it was from the readings and the Bible, and the gospel reading from yesterday? I don't know. You may continue.
If there's no discussion, Mr. Chairman, I'll call for the question.
The question has been called. Senator Nelson.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I think that, I guess sometimes we move a little bit too fast and then we make a vote, and then after the vote happens, and for me, sometimes I think, what just happened? So I just wanted to be clear. I mean, last week we addressed this supplemental appropriations revenue fund, and it's based on the collections, thereby, in a sense, forcing the governor now and who the next governor will be to collect these taxes. But my concern is well, there's two things. First is, if we believe that this money can be collected, then we should do away with all taxes and then just put the whole 73 million down here to supplement the budget. But if there's a question, I'm sure that's, well, for me, I feel that there's a question if this $18 million can even be collected and realized in time to fund the needs of the government. And so here we are now addressing all these amendments to directly fund agencies that we don't even know if this money can or will be collected. And so, I mean, I just don't think that perhaps we should take a little bit more caution in these measures. I mean, I know that taxing the people is a very big issue, but if this money is not realized, we will probably see a bunch of furloughs and impacts into our government services. So this is the only precautionary method. I mean, this is $18 million. It's a significant amount of money that would fund the agencies, and if it's not collected for any reason or the other, then the people will hurt because of these decisions that we are about to make. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Anyone else before we call the question? Senator Morrison.
Mr. Chair, I along the lines of the previous speaker, again, I was stating earlier, it seems that we're going to be adjusting numbers as we go along. I'm not sure. Again, we're on the assumption that these amendments are going to pass. But when we looked at the SAR fund when it was established, believe in not too long ago, we've seen that fund fluctuate, and the way my understanding it was used for was mainly tied to supplement critical areas within our government, specific to health insurance, along the lines, but it was never tied to the operations of agencies, and that's where lies my concern. Again, I appreciate the author trying to come up with a concept. Again, I still seem we're guessing if it may work, and I'm not sure we're creating a good incentive or a bad incentive here. But the same agencies that we see are tied to the SAR fund, even despite the progress that we just recently made here with the two directors here of Reverend Tax and DOA, it seems like, great, we appreciate the progress you made, but we're going to tie a different type of incentive to you. Should you not collect, the progress may, we may go counter to your progress. So, I'm just concerned that the way we're tying this to the operations of the agencies, is different than how we used the SAR fund in the past. And then clearly in different reports on the OPA or the OPA, even what was budgeted in the past for these needs, these critical needs within our government, it never surmounted to that budgeted number. So yes, we have adopted this a number of 18,180,000, but just based on tracking or reports, we've never, at least the SAR fund has never collected what we've budgeted for. So again, I'm cautioning, but given that we're trying something new and tying it to the operations of the agencies compared to what the SAR fund was used for in the past, I would have to object, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Uggan, did I see your hand go up?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to understand the nature of the amendments and readjusting the figures. But I want to just make a general comment, because I think that when we're looking at the SAR fund, which is any revenue that's identified and collected above and beyond the projected revenue of that fiscal year, should really be directed towards the Supplemental Appropriations Fund or Revenue Fund, the SAR fund. And we don't even need to look too far back. And this is neither, I guess this is neither here nor there, only because it's not being applied. But the tax amnesty collections, Mr. Speaker, should have gone into the SAR fund, so that in fact this body, rightfully so, would have had the opportunity to be able to direct those to areas that we identify as critical need, such as GMH, and such as Simon Sanchez High School, and starting that process. So those were revenues that were pursued after the passage of the Public Law 34-87. So those revenues surely should have been deposited into the SAR fund. So that's why I'm saying we don't have to look too far. But then moving forward, looking at the tools and the resources that we are trying to provide Revenue Tax as the collecting arm of this government, we heard from the Director of Revenue Tax that they've already armed themselves with additional personnel within the collection division and within some of the other sections within Revenue Tax. So this body, by virtue of its commitment, passing and authorizing the budget for this fiscal year, gave that authorization and the appropriation to hire those additional collection agents and other personnel within Revenue Tax. So we're taking care of the personnel needs that were highlighted repeatedly last year during the course of the budget discussions. One of the other amendments that has been accepted is providing $300,000, albeit from the SAR fund, to go towards the acquisition of a tax attorney through the Attorney General's office, so that that individual can support and assist Revenue Tax in pursuing some of the outstanding tax receivables collections. Whether we're talking about $73 million or we're talking about $18.4 million now in terms of aggressive collections. So we've taken care of two critical requirements, in my opinion. Personnel that they insisted that they needed to go out and collect additional revenues. Also providing for a mechanism so that they can acquire a tax attorney to pursue, to prosecute if necessary. We always want our taxpayers, at least from my perspective, to come in and establish an arrangement for payment so that it's recognized that they're meeting their obligation. That should always be the first option if, in fact, they're not able to meet their tax obligation immediately. But ideally, we want them to pay their taxes up front. They're not able to meet that obligation, then enter into an arrangement with the tax collection entity of the Government of Guam, Revenue Tax, so that you can meet those obligations over a short period of time. If not, then prosecution could be an option by this government. We've provided them the second mechanism, in addition to personnel, to pursue outstanding tax receivables. So is $18.1 million a reasonable amount to expect the administration to aggressively go pursue the outstanding so-called collectible $73 million that remains out there in outstanding tax receivables I believe it is. I believe it is. But I did hint at automation as an option in terms of providing additional resources. But I'm sure that the chief executive can utilize his tools and his resources in terms of transfer authority if that is a priority that they need to implement to assist the government of Guam in collecting outstanding tax receivables. So, Mr. Speaker, I support the amendment, albeit, you know, I really think that the legislature should also be part of this SAR appropriations, because if we're going to insist that the executive branch aggressively go out and collect, I think also this legislature should have a component of the SAR appropriation so that it's tied to the collectability of these funds that have been identified as part of the funding source for this upcoming fiscal year's budget. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator? Any other senator? Senator Tom Adda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the concern that I have with how we've set this up is that if we take a look at the original budget figure, the total of $6 million, if you take 1/4 of that, then that amount, take 1/4 of the requirement for personnel, for operations, and for utilities, it comes up to about that $1.5 million that we're appropriating from the general fund, which I guess, for lack of anything else, I will call that sure money, money that the administration will be able to operate with during the first quarter of the next fiscal year. The concern that I have is that as optimistic as I want to be, I really don't have the confidence that the current administration in this, in this last 3 months of its administration is really going to aggressively try and collect on this SAR, so that at least when the next administration that comes in, there would have been some collections already made, and that they will then have funds available to operate with. So then, if there is no aggressive effort to collect on these outstanding taxes, they basically can get through the first quarter of next fiscal year with really without any effort at all to collect on the SAR, because they've got this sure money to take them through the remainder of this administration. So I do have that concern. I'm trying to be as optimistic as I can that this administration, during its final months, will in fact go out there and be as aggressive as if it was, in its first 3 months of its administration. I'm trying to maintain that optimism, but I really am concerned that that aggressiveness will not be there. And the only way that we can then really kind of stay on top of that is that we conduct monthly oversight hearing to find out where are things. So with that, I just wanted to put on record that concern that I have, that there's really no incentive on the part of the current administration, who's on its way out, to aggressively collect on the SAR, to make sure that the incoming administration will have funds available to operate with for the remainder of the fiscal year. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other senator? If not, you may close, Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the input from my colleagues. There are options if we wanted to make some adjustments, but we will need to go back to the drawing board. I do want to put out this reassurance, Mr. Chairman, and that is this. Management of the government is not linear. The operations of the governor isn't just limited to how this appropriation is structured. The governor will have a transfer authority if they need to transfer funds to be able to make up for any kind of lull in collections. The governor also has $6 million in compact impact money, which is the entirety of their office budget anyway. And that compact impact money can be strategically applied to, again, make up for any lull or pause in collection efforts. The option to raise taxes, Mr. Chairman, would still be on the table if these collections aren't materializing. And the option to reorganize at the management level has already been provided with the recent legislation that we passed as sponsored by Senator Huggan. So there are many tools at the administration's disposal to be able to manage. What we need to be mindful of is, if we're not going to do this, we've already gone through the exercise of exploring tax increases. This body has already gone through the exercise of trying to find cuts. This is now where we are. And so if we don't want to do this, then we got to go back to the drawing board on those other options, because we have a budget to balance. What we're saying of this amendment is we're going to balance this budget based on what everybody's campaigning on. Everybody's campaigning that they wouldn't raise taxes, they'll go out and they'll collect. So what we've artfully done is we've tagged those collections to those very entities that are responsible for doing that. If there's any challenges in that effort, again, they can transfer funds. They have compact impact money to supplement. But by doing this, we are compelling those very same campaign promises to materialize. And we're not doing it as a political maneuver. We're doing it as a point of reality that we do have $18 million that we need to find. So here it is. The $73 million in collections is what Reventac said is out there that they can collect on. This is a fraction of that at $18 million. The concern of whether or not there's a history of collections, I would like to just refresh everyone's memory that in the last month, we had $14 million in unpaid taxes hit the books in terms of what's out there. And that wasn't even part of that $73 million. There's a lot of taxes out there that aren't even part of that $73 million. That $73 million is just what we already know we can collect. It'll be very interesting as we move forward with additional policy to further enhance the regulatory environment, how much more taxes are going to appear out of the woodwork. As we work on drafting an alcohol stamp legislation, we may see a chunk of alcohol money all of a sudden materialize. This is what happens when we have the lax enforcement that we've had. And this is a policy move that will ensure that we not only remedy that problem of the past, but we demonstrate that we're going to make a commitment into the future that these bad practices are no longer going to continue. I'm not too concerned about the administration, the incoming or the current administration's ability to make ends meet. They have many tools available, and this action does not close the door on any future options that we've explored over the past week and rejected. They can come back to the table and they can be revisited if there is the need for that. But right now, today is our opportunity to make a policy statement that everybody who's campaigning that they're going to collect, now is your opportunity to do so, and for the benefit of the people of Guam, so that our taxes don't go up, our cost of living doesn't increase. That's the option that's before us today. We've already adopted the figure. Now let's apply that figure to the agencies that are responsible for collecting: the Office of the Governor, the Department of Revenue and Taxation, the Department of Administration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On this motion, there has been an objection. All those in favor of the amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Morrison, there was an objection. There was an objection. All those in favor, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes. Your next amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next amendment is for the Department of Revenue and Taxation.
Please. You're
So moved.
recognized.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Do you wish to speak?
I'll yield it for any questions or
Okay.
comments.
Senator Rodriguez, after Senator Rodriguez on the second amendment. After him? Okay. Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, last week when we were first discussing the SAR fund, I spoke about how it was a creative way to kind of balance this budget, on paper at least. And so I still think, you know, it was a creative way. I didn't object to the first two amendments. The first amendment to set an amount on what we anticipate to collect on the SAR fund, and the second to tie in the governor's office budget into the SAR fund. Because really, with the passing of that amendment, and it was really kind of a low-hanging fruit when you kind of tie it into to the governor's office, and especially for those of us here who are running for that office, it's easy to say, hey, you guys are speaking about this, you guys go out, collect it, and we'll tie your budget to this collection. And so that's fine, because if I'm fortunate to be there, we'll deal with it at that point. However, when it comes to the critical agencies of Rev and Tax and the next amendment of Department of Administration, that's where my concern lies, Mr. Speaker. I believe it was in 2011 when the first time this SAR fund was created. And I believe it was that budget that about 14 million was appropriated from the SAR fund. The only audit that I was able to find was done back in 2012. We over appropriated from that SAR fund. For whatever reason, I believe only 6 million out of 14 million was collected, and for whatever reasons, the other revenues that was anticipated was not collected, and so that poses a problem, Mr. Speaker, and of course, no one's going to dispute that we want to go out there and collect the taxes that are owed to this government, but to tie that into this coming fiscal year for critical agencies like Rev and Tax, who are going to be tasked to go out there and collect these taxes, or DOA, who is tasked to manage our finances, and already running on very, very thin ice with what we give them today. I don't think it's the right move for us to do. And so, no doubt, taxes will be collected. I just don't know how much. 18 million? I don't know, Mr. Speaker. We've had an active effort right now by this administration to collect taxes with their tax amnesty program. And if they've collected, I believe they're anticipating about 30 million to collect by the end of today, which they extended, and so hopefully there's more that they anticipate to collect. But after that program ends, I don't know how much more we're going to anticipate to collect if, with all the efforts being put into place now, and you collect as much as you could. After that, you know, I don't know. If we receive 18 million, then good. We receive more, the better. But the concern that I have is that you tie it into agencies like Rev and Tax or DOA. That's where my concern lies. And I think just hearing the sentiments of those in the room from last week and even this morning, this is really a, we're not sure type of if we're going to collect this money from this account and putting it into this fund. We heard one of the, one of the supporters of this amendment as well last week say, that it's really, it's not for sure. It's really, you kind of have that sense in your mind where you want to collect it. Our desire to balance this budget, to pass something is there. But then when it comes down to agencies like Rev and Tax and DOA, that's when, I believe we have to speak up. And so for that, Mr. Speaker, I object to this. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Estevez.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to, I thank the previous speaker for their comments, but I think to add to the conversation, I think one important thing to consider in terms of future collection is, at least with regards to the tax cuts applied to income tax and corporate taxes for the community, I think one thing is the way money balances out. Even communities and businesses fund things based on priority. Fund things based on priorities. Payroll, sometimes taxes may get delayed. I don't necessarily believe that that translates to the inability to pay the taxes, but I think it's more of a timing issue. One of the advantages of the tax cuts, at least in both in the community and the business sector, is the ability to have more flexibility to move money around and balance both growth and obligations. So I think moving forward, as time passes and as both businesses and individuals are able to have more flexibility with money in their pocket, I think you will see an increase, both an uptick in standard collections throughout the fiscal years, and I think in good faith efforts to pay on or settle prior obligations to this government. And so I just wanted to add that and introduce that into the conversation as something to consider.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard? Any other senator wish to be heard? And if not, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to reiterate that the entire budget is based on projections. The entire budget. So every revenue stream that we're anticipating here is a projected amount. All we're doing is we're now projecting also our collections. We're basing that on what the agency has already told us is out there. $73 million they believe can be collected. So I'm not afraid of that number, and I'm not afraid of 25% of that number, which is what the $18 million represents. I think that of all the projected figures, these are the most certain, because these are taxes that are already assessed. These are amounts that are already owed. Any of our tax projections can fluctuate by economic activities changing, but these collections will not fluctuate. These are amounts owed. The challenge will be collecting them and using the various tools and resources available to do that. If we're worried about the tracking of the SAR fund showing that it's been overprojected in certain periods of time, we need to also be mindful of the fact that how the administration manages cash and how that cash hits certain funds is not a reflection of what's out there. A case in point, Mr. Chairman, is the income tax refund trust account. If we were to base income tax refund costs on what's hitting that fund and the tracking of that fund, we would look like we have a very small income tax refund liability. But the reality is that money comes in, it doesn't hit that fund, and then it goes and pays tax refunds. Our income tax refund liability is a sum far greater than any tracking of the income tax refund trust account. Same goes for the Supplemental Appropriations Revenue Fund. Just because the tracking of that fund is low doesn't mean that we didn't bring in collections. It just means that those collections never hit the fund. A case in point is the tax amnesty money. We just spent about, $13, $14 million of that should have hit the SAR, but it didn't. It doesn't mean that it wasn't collected, it just means that it wasn't booked. What we're doing now is we're requiring it to be booked. And we're basing it on what we know is out there by what the agency told us. So that agency that told us that is out there is this very agency that we're tagging this appropriation to. The Department of Revenue and Taxation came here and testified in a budget session that they have $73 million that they can collect. We're telling them to collect $6 million of that, not even 10% of that, for their own operations. That's their job. Let's let them fund themselves by doing their job. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. There's been an objection to the motion. So on this motion, all those in favor, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes. Is 8. 1, 2, 3. Motion passes. Department of Administration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So moved. The amendment as circulated.
Any senator wish to be heard on this motion? Senator, there's been an objection. Any other senator wish objection? Any other senator wish to speak? All right. Do you wish to close, or do you have any statement? If not, we'll call the question. All those in favor of this amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. Senator Nicholas.
Just a point of information, Mr. Chairman, with the failure of that motion, we now have a $5 million we have a $5 million problem with
No,
respect to
we can deal with that. Let's get through your amendments.
Well, it takes us to the next amendment, Mr. Chairman. The next amendment is for the Department of Education. If you look at this amendment, you see education's general fund appropriations change to $201 million. Part and parcel of that was the $5 million that we were reprogramming from the recently failed amendment of the Department of Administration. Colleagues, the way these amendments worked was we pushed general fund money into priorities, and so since we're not funding other agencies who have supplemental appropriations revenue fund money, someone's going to have to make a motion to fund education with SAR money. Or to fund the subsequent amendment of the Guam Fire Department with SAR money.
We'll have to take a short recess for a second because there's issue of the vote, the count. There's question as to the count on the Department of Revenue and Taxation. No, the previous one. They're claiming that they thought I counted 8. All those who voted in favor of the Department of Revenue and Taxation cut.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to request a roll call vote then, if we're uncertain as to how the votes are turning out on any of these amendments. A roll call vote on the Revenue and Taxation, roll call vote on the Department of Administration.
Okay. Let's go back to Department of Revenue and Taxation. Roll call. Everybody understand we're doing a roll call on those two votes because for some reason we're not. Okay, You don't have your three, Senator Nicholas, unless somebody else is going to.
Then point of order, Mr. Chairman, since we gavelled the vote on revenue and taxation, we would need to do a motion for reconsideration.
There was I counted 8. I'll do a second roll call. This is getting. Do I have a third? All right, fine. There's still none. All right. Let's take a recess until 2.